Good morning, everyone. May God's peace and blessings be with all of you. It is really such an honor and such a joy, more than anything, to be here with you today. I am so blessed to be among people of faith, people who remember God regularly, who care deeply, who care enough to really stand forth with moral courage and say our faith can be something good in the world, and I'm going to be part of that. I'm so grateful to God for having created us with this diversity. In the Holy Quran, God says that certainly as the creator of all things, God could have made us one people with no difference among us. Sounds like a recipe for perfect harmony, but it was God's will to create us with diversity, all kinds of diversity, linguistic, racial, including religious. And in fact, it is through these differences that we come to know each other, we come to know God, because we explore what we can be and how we can be better. In the Holy Quran, God says, "Worship God and do not ascribe divinity to anything apart from him. Be good to your parents and to relatives and to orphans, to those in need and to neighbors to whom you are close, and to neighbors with whom there is some distance, to the friend by your side and the wayfarer, and for those who are under your authority. Verily, God does not love those who are arrogant and boastful." The Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, said, "None of you believes who goes to bed satiated while his neighbor is hungry." And he said, "By God, he does not believe the person from whose harm his neighbor is not safe." The obligation to care for the neighbor, to do good for the neighbor, whether that neighbor is a friend, is a relative, or is someone with whom you do not have a particularly close relationship, is an obligation in Islamic law and in Islamic ethics. Now, why all of this emphasis on the neighbor? The reality is, it's not always easy to get along with neighbors. Even those who share our local customs and have lived in the same area for generations, we know that. We've all had annoying neighbors. And maybe sometimes, maybe in our student days more, we were not always the best neighbor either. There's a delicate balance in being a neighbor of granting privacy and being helpful. We have to judge our circumstances and decide what we can put in the public area or maybe in our front yard as opposed to the backyard, and that differs from place to place. Whether we sit on our front porch and socialize or whether the back deck is the more appropriate place, because where we live, like in Canada, you keep your socializing to the back. What is tasteful or distasteful to put out front? Very large decorative fountain, perhaps, in your front yard that some neighbors may not have thought was particularly appropriate or in keeping with the aesthetics of the neighborhood. There's a lot of conformity, social conformity, that is expected of neighbors, and slight deviations from it can make people feel annoyed that it's not quite right. So it's not that easy. It's not that easy being a neighbor, and that's why we're taught to be good to the neighbor. We have to remind ourselves of that. And we have to be reminded that it's a moral obligation to do good to them and not be harmful. And what is harmful to them? Well, again, as Reverend Isaac said, we won't know what's harmful to them unless we know them. Now, in the modern era, the stresses might even be more. Some people have tried to escape the pressures of conformity on our traditional cultures by escaping to the city, and what they really want is freedom and independence from the expectations of their neighbors about how they should live or not live. They're seeking a new identity or new way of being in a city. Affluence can also divide us and can be an instrument of separation, to put that large lawn or that high fence that can separate us. Cars, so that we could drive right by our neighbor without ever having to interact with them. Technology can also divide us. We don't need each other as much as we used to, at least for those of us who live in urban areas, until a disaster strikes and suddenly the neighbor becomes very important when you need your electricity doesn't work and you might need to use that fireplace and you don't have any wood, or you need to run a line from your neighbor's generator when the power goes out, as it did when I lived in Connecticut and we had a snowstorm that knocked out our power for 9 days, and believe me, everyone knew who their neighbor was then. But there are some people who still live a lifestyle where they do need to rely on their neighbors and others to help them complete a job, those in agricultural areas and other places where, calling in people from around them is necessary just to get a job done. Where I live in Canada right now, there's still a lot of farmers and people engaged in agricultural work. Despite all of the modern technology and farm equipment, you still need a number of extra hands when it comes to the harvest. And so you need to know those people, and that forces us into relationship. So sometimes we want that, and sometimes we don't want that. In today's world, it's a time of movement and displacement, voluntary or involuntary moving around. Whether they're environmental disasters or economic collapse or political upheaval, people are in motion constantly. And we ourselves, those who are privileged and aren't forced to move, nevertheless still do it in search of education or employment opportunity, or maybe different weather even that suits our constitution. So many of us don't have the time for that, the luxury of time to get to know people, where over a lifetime you experience the ups and downs of living in a neighborhood and of getting to know people and of sharing some difficulties and hardships in the area and of celebrating together. So all of this makes being a neighbor much more challenging, and it means that we're required to be more attentive and mindful of these relationships. And sometimes we have to construct what are somewhat artificial opportunities to get to know each other, because a kind of passive approach to getting to know each other just might not be sufficient. New neighbors can be, in a time of change, new neighbors can also be really scapegoated for the loss of an old way of life. And I think about this when we see the resentment that sometimes is turned towards migrants. And I'm not even someone who is free from this kind of tendency, because I think it is a human tendency. I've returned now after over 20 years in the United States. I consider myself an Americanized Canadian. And I've returned to the place where my ancestors have lived over 200 years. So I've got very deep roots in southern Ontario, a lot of traditions and habits and fond memories. We all have those fond memories of the rhythm of life when we were children. And it's different. It's changed now. And it's very difficult sometimes not to distinguish the fact that these changes have come as a result of choices that we've made, as much as a result of new people who have come into the area with different customs and habits. It's so easy to say, well, these people who are building this or their house looks like this, or their customs are this way. They're replacing or they're displacing what we had when already we had moved on. But nostalgia is a big part of the human experience. We still mourn our expulsion from the Garden of Eden, so it's primordial in us to mourn the past, the childhood that we look at through this rosy lens, even though we know it wasn't always great. So I think we need to allow people and find ways to allow people to mourn what it has been lost that they thought was good, and to share experiences about a way of life that necessarily felt closer and more loving and where people cared more about each other. If we are able to do that as a shared human experience as part of our dialogue, we may not jump as quickly into scapegoating and blaming the newcomers to our area for having destroyed that, because they didn't. And it's also easy when someone is a stranger or a foreigner to jump to an explanation that is racialized or ideological when they do something we don't like. I mean, how easy it is to blame the immigrants who moved into the house next door from this or that country and say, well, see, those kind of people do that, when remember that Betty and John, who used to live there, also were pretty annoying neighbors, and they used to put their garbage cans just a little bit too close to my fence for my taste. I thought they should have put it a little bit more on their side of the property. But we jump to racialized explanations. We jump very quickly to stereotypes when people are from what we perceive to be another group. I would say that in particular in this time, when we look at what it means to be a neighbor and we try to overcome stereotypes and prejudice and a resort so quickly to hate and dislike and irritation, that we have to understand there are some things that truly are different in the time we live today. There are some things that are universal and are old stories. They're in the Bible, they're in the Quran, they're in the narratives of human history of difference being easily susceptible to division and hatred. That is an old story, but there's some things that are new now. And one of the things that I've noticed, having been engaged in interfaith work and social justice work and public engagement for so long, is that there are no longer any naive encounters. And what I mean by that is that when I began public engagement and speaking, say in the early 1990s, in a major way, that I would be able to speak to a group like this, go to a church or a library or a civic group, and be able to give an explanation of a topic like, what does Islam say about duties to the neighbor or the rights of the neighbor? I would be able to explain it. I would give quotes from the Quran, statements from the Prophet Muhammad, as I did when I began today. Then I would open it up for questions, and people would ask a few questions. We would have a little back and forth discussion, comparative, and that would be it.